Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending this panel. We have a great group of people today to discuss Pear Therapeutics, but really to focus on this industry as a whole. As four people that are still moving this industry forward, we're going to take a little bit of time to do a little bit of armchair quarterbacking and look at one of the companies this year that didn't make it, but had a profound impact on the trajectory of this industry, both positive and negative. So I think hopefully it'll be an exciting conversation. So first we'll start off with our intros about who you are, what you're doing, and your initial feedback on Pear before we dive into some of the details of areas that they focused on. Why don't we start with Eric G?
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Gastfriend. I'm the co-founder and president of DynamiCare Health. We are a digital therapeutics company, digital health company that was competing with Pear, actually. And now we're a little bit more lonely. But we also do digital therapeutic for substance use disorder, opioid stimulants, and alcohol. Focused on contingency management, which is rewards that we do on a smart debit card, and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, self-guided lessons in the app. And one thing that makes us unique is we also do remote substance tests using a smart breathalyzer and saliva tests over selfie video to tie to the rewards. We're rewarding people for staying sober and staying engaged in treatment. And my take on Pear and digital therapeutics is I think Pear really pushed the industry forward in many ways and was a pioneer, and that it's been harmful to the industry that they didn't make it, which is unfortunate. I would say three main reasons that I see for the bankruptcy earlier this year. One is that the expectations were too high, too hyped up, too unrealistic. They raised a lot of money at very high valuations, including a lot of debt. And when you do that, you kind of need to keep the hype going in order to be able to raise the next round. And so, as an entrepreneur, you set expectations with the market, your investors, and the hype they generated, they were able to raise a lot of money, but then it didn't materialize fast enough for them to make the next round of funding, especially as interest rates increased. So I think that was one issue. Second issue, which Corey McCann pointed out in his kind of final LinkedIn post, is the lack of payer coverage. I think payers were way too slow and cautious on reimbursing the products, and kind of like said they wanted to see more evidence, but I think the bar for payers for a provider to add to their network is like very low. Like here, like as long as you have a license, you can enter the network. For a drug or medical device, it's up here. And then for something new that they don't currently cover, like a digital therapeutic, it's here and they just move it up and down or they feel like. So I think that makes it really hard. Although Pear made a huge amount of progress, over 30 million covered lives, and they got Medicaid in Oklahoma, Massachusetts, and Florida to cover it. And then the final thing I would point out is the cost effectiveness. I think people unfairly criticize Pear for not having enough evidence of effectiveness. I think they did have good evidence of effectiveness compared to other drugs that are covered in substance use disorder. I do think they were priced high. So I think that's a fair criticism. But it's yeah, I think that there's a pathway forward for the digital therapeutics industry. Click Therapeutics recently did a deal with Indivior to build a new digital therapeutic for opioid use disorder. So I was actually surprised to see that, given in the wake of Pear, that they're kind of going gung-ho on a new one, going through the same probably prescription digital therapeutic FDA model. And I think that we will see a resurgence, especially based on the work that Andy, you're doing at DTA and with the Access to Prescription Digital Therapeutics Act that's on the Hill now. If we can get Medicare to cover it, I think that will create a huge slew of new opportunities for the industry. So I think this is just a temporary setback, and in a few years, we'll see a new resurgence.
Great information. Let's hop over to Seth next.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Seth Feuerstein, psychiatrist by background, but serial entrepreneur and serial digital health entrepreneur. And I've been fortunate to found and run digital health companies that have become profitable, been acquired successfully, gone public. I've gotten reimbursement 2 different times for 2 very different types of digital interventions. I founded and run a company now called Therapeutics and sit on I think 7 boards of directors. And I'm on the faculty at Yale in the Department of Psychiatry. I think, let's see, Therapeutics, we're, I'd say, different in certain fundamental ways from other digital therapeutics companies. And I should point out terminology matters and is not yet sort of well-defined in the space. I tend to talk about over-the-counter digital therapeutics, FDA-cleared digital therapeutics, in the same way you might think about other, interventions that people use. I think it's an evolving field. Therapeutics is really focused on areas that we consider to be uniquely problematic and high value for patients, providers, and payers. And our lead programs currently are in suicide attempt reduction and suicidality reduction. And to give you context for that, suicide is the number 2 cause of death in people in their teens into their mid-20s, the number 3 cause of death for people from their mid-20s into their mid-30s, and the number 4 cause of death from the mid-30s until essentially almost Medicare age. It's the only leading killer without a prescription product, so it's just very different than a lot of other, really any prescription area that would be novel, digital or not. And so I think, what happened to Pear? I mean, ultimately, bankruptcy is about spending too much too quickly and not redirecting fast enough. I think at a macro level, many people don't understand or realize contextually the last 8 years were extremely unusual in digital funding generally and in digital health funding generally. Then at the same time, I think there was a lot of excitement and promise. And I should point out, I built a successful over-the-counter digital therapy company. We had randomized controlled trials. They were published in top journals. We sold that to a national payer almost 10 years ago and scaled it to about 100 million benefit lives. So we had really good data. That data was often comparable to Pear's products, especially for insomnia. I think maybe I'll say it a little bit differently, and I've said this before in other places. If Pear's products were $1, they could have gotten universal coverage. And if they were $29, they probably could have gotten universal coverage. After that, it's a question of value and imperative and incentive for the payers and for people to pay out of pocket, however you want to market those products. In healthcare and in digital health, everyone talks about product market fit, but really it's product market payer fit in healthcare. And that fit can take a lot of time and a lot of sophistication and a lot of relationships. And you need to be, I think, personally, really careful with how quickly you spend money until you have a really good sense of the traction you're getting in those areas. And, in the biotech industry, I think Amgen was founded in 1980. That was 43 years ago. By the 1990s, and things moved slower and funding was slower 43 years ago. So it took more time. But by the 1990s, there were hundreds of biotech companies that actually even then raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And today, most people can't name more than a half dozen, but those companies are humongous. And it's not unlike the first internet bubble 20 years ago. There were hundreds of internet companies, and now there are a handful that are humongous and drive the economy in many ways. And so I think that, this space is not that different from other spaces where there will be winners, and those winners can become humongous. And it's going to take some time for people to figure out, we've had drugs, we've had devices. Now we have this almost third leg of the stool, which is digital. And there'll be some disorders where digital plus drug is the best. And there'll be some where digital plus device is best. There'll be some where digital alone is the best. Mm-hmm. And it brings really high value. And I think that's going to be the kind of formula for figuring this out for all the stakeholders.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, it's funny because you talk to some people and they're like, oh man, Pear went under. Is this the end of the industry? And the answer to that is 100% no. The industry will continue. It's part of our daily lives, even if you don't realize it. I think some people may push back on the prescription piece of it, but I don't know anybody that doesn't use technology as some part of their health, even if it's just monitoring steps and your heart rate.
But by the way, biotech. Oh, well, keep going. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's all right. With that, last but certainly not least is Eric Bailey.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I'm in very good company, and I think Eric and Seth captured everything very, very well. So I'm Eric Bailey. I work for a small consulting firm called Third Horizon Strategies that really is focused on addictions payment reform is one of our main swim lanes, along with a broader context of behavioral health systems change. And we're involved in a number of different engagements across the country, anything ranging from statewide addiction payment reform all the way down through individual provider strategic exercises to really think about how they evolve and grow over time. Prior to that, I actually joined this firm in May, this past May. Prior to that, I had spent 15 years at a very large payer system and got to know Eric Gastfriend quite well. In my work there, I oversaw the SUD and opioid overdose response strategy across the entire organization, all lines of business. Every rabbit hole you can think of, I went down. I think we're all can agree that the opioid overdose epidemic has left no stone unturned. Every dark corner has had a light shined on it with respect to the impact. So I am a clinician by background, so I tend to look at things through a clinical lens and also person in long-term recovery. I think about things in terms of the triple aim, primarily with respect to improvement in access, cost efficiency, and then of course quality. As Seth had alluded to, the COVID was unprecedented, at least in our recent history, with respect to really pushing digital therapeutics, telehealth to the next level in a way that simply just had not been pressure tested prior to that. So mental health, behavioral health, SUD lends itself very well to these types of solutions. So I was very, very involved and very interested in learning about how Pear in particular could have an impact on our members across the entire country, across all lines of business. So it was definitely something I became very steeped in and actually quite frustrated in as well. As Eric Gastfriend had alluded to, and Seth had alluded to this as well, it is extraordinarily difficult to convince very large organizations that have a number of different lines of business to pay for something that's cutting edge, that's different, that's unique, without treasure troves of randomized controlled trials. I don't want to discount that. It's very important, but digital therapeutics are something a bit different than a biologic, just by very nature of safety risk. The approach I took was, at least with leadership in the company that I was working with, was that we should really do our due diligence and provide an opportunity to really do some pressure testing and see how this goes, within our population. We really owe it to the individuals who are struggling with opioid use disorder to give this a whirl, particularly when we know that there are already people who are paying out of pocket for this, So there were a number of different ways that I could have continued to really push that. Unfortunately, Pear did fold while I was still at that payer, but the industry is not dead, and I would wholeheartedly agree with Seth as someone who was around during the .com bubble burst. There will certainly be organizations that survive, continue to consolidate, and really push the industry in a way that will continue to address that triple aim that I had mentioned. With access, quality, and cost efficiency. I truly believe that. So again, thank you for having me with this conversation. It's very interesting. The last thing I would say is, and I was, when we were prepping for this, I brought up the peak of inflated expectations, which is this classic visualization of our expectations with respect to digital solutions. And there's sort of this flashpoint of need, and then this peak of expectations goes way up into the stratosphere on this curve, and then and then it just goes tanks. You get this trough of disillusionment, is what it's called, and kind of this like, okay, we've had this great hype, now what? And then there's this slope of enlightenment, which is where I think we're at now. And we'll get to a point where we have this plateau of productivity eventually in that graph. And if you haven't looked up that visual, I'd encourage you to do that. It's actually quite helpful.
Thanks, Eric. All great points. Before we jump in, I will just mention I'm Andy Molnar. I'm the CEO of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. So we're the trade organization for digital therapeutics companies. Pear was a member. We worked very closely together. I try and stay neutral often because my goal is to move the industry forward as best as possible. So with Pear, the one thing I will add, though, because expectations being too high, said by Eric, payer coverage, said by Eric, cost effectiveness, said by Eric, spending too much too quickly, said by Seth, again reiterated by Eric, the peak of inflated expectations. So the expectations being so high, Pear did a great job at setting expectations way too high. So you could call that a bad job, but that kind of hurt everybody when they weren't successful. Whereas if they had set expectations appropriately, I think the question is, would the industry be where it is? Because they did such a good job of getting the word digital therapeutic and prescription digital therapeutic out there. They spent so much money on things like government affairs to move legislation forward. They spent a ton of money on marketing. They hired a full sales force that started getting Medicaid coverage. We saw things with them at a different level than we've seen with other companies, but they spent way too much money. And so I think, as we're almost on minute 17 here, and I think we've really covered the crux of it so far. But what I want to ask, and I think particularly to Eric first, is, was their business model right? Because you're a competitor of theirs, you're still in business, you have similar treatments, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, as well as some additional things they didn't have, with a completely different business model. And was what they did too early? Do we think that a prescription digital therapeutic maybe is the future? Or did they kind of get it all wrong? And maybe it's different. Yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, of course, it's a lot easier to comment from the sidelines than to actually do it. But I think, when I heard that they were going down this like FDA prescription app route, I was very surprised. And to me, it did not make sense, because you do not need to get an FDA approval to put a digital therapeutic on the market, as Seth and I have done without the FDA. And just because you get the FDA approval, as Pear learned, does not mean that payers have to cover it. So it's a very expensive pathway to go down, and I didn't really see the value. But by the time that they declared bankruptcy, I had seen the value of why they did it, which is digital therapeutics has a square peg and a round hole problem, which is that typically payers cover provider contracts, which are services from licensed providers, medical devices, medications, or they have the vendor category, which is catch-all, and it's not a good category to be in. And so within those three, it's not really clear where digital health, digital therapeutics falls. Pear decided that they would fall squarely in the medical device category. I think they wanted the medication, but it wasn't really realistic. So the FDA approval as a medical device really helped them slot into the contracting pathway for that option, and made it much easier for them to get billing codes and count towards medical loss ratio and all of that kind of internal dynamics that happens at payers that Eric Bailey was dealing with in his previous role. So I think it can't be overstated how important it is to fit into a payer's existing payment pathways. Just because it's a great product and clinically beneficial and even cost effective doesn't mean that payers even can cover it if they want to. So I think the FDA pathway was valuable for that reason. And then I think it was priced too high, but Seth, I know you mentioned like if they priced it $29 per prescription, everyone would have covered it. But the product and the core mechanism of action included the contingency management. That's the financial incentives for engaging with the product and staying sober. And so patients could earn hundreds of dollars. So if they priced it at $29 per patient, they would have lost money on every prescription. Also, with like the fundraising strategy, they needed to demonstrate high margins. Otherwise, they couldn't raise the money. So it's hard for them to come down from that price point. Seth, I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I think that everything Eric said is true, but I think everything Eric said is with the lens of the addiction product that competes against Pear's addiction product. Pear had an insomnia product, right, that didn't have any expenses. So I was making comments that are generally applicable. So again, Eric talked about categories. Those categories exist because at one point there were products that actually led to the creation of those categories. It's not like someone said, we're going to cover drugs, and then people develop drugs to fit into that category. It's that there were antibiotics that saved lives, and eventually insurance companies had to figure out how to pay for those in the FDA. So everything Eric said is accurate. So Eric said that, you don't have to go through the FDA. Well, actually, some products do have to go through the FDA. So if I have a digital product that's going to cure cancer, I have to go through the FDA. And I can tell you, if you have a digital product and you say you're preventing suicides, you have to go through the FDA. The FDA has made that very clear. So we have, in our case, have something called investigational device exam. Like, we are different, so everything depends on what you're doing, and I would suggest that the products that are category defining will actually encourage and excite payers about covering them. And for context, while nothing is guaranteed, our business focused on suicide actually has the largest PBM owner as an investor in the business, so I think that it all depends on the value and the necessity and the imperative around the problem you're solving. Interestingly, like if I said I had software, and this is different than the way most people use the term therapeutic, but a lot of people do include diagnostics in the digital therapeutic phrase. If I say I'm going to be diagnosing cancer that's deadly, you can bet the FDA is going to require approval for that. So it's all about the medical claim. And I think, Eric, everything you said is accurate.
The claims and the safety profile.
Yeah. And as Eric B pointed out, the safety profile is pretty positive in most of these cases, but the safety profile shifts if you start to make claims about things that are death related. So.
Okay. We don't have a ton of time left, so I want to ask one more question, Eric, and then I want to talk about the future and where we're headed. So Eric, Corey emphatically blamed payers on his way out for the lack of progress and for them going bankrupt. Do you agree with that or disagree?
I would disagree with that. I think there were a myriad of issues that led up. Well, not surprising. I mean, there were a myriad of issues that led up to that, and as Seth talked about, of course, payers play a role in that, but it didn't all come down to that. I will say one thing, Andy, about this, and this was one of my biggest frustrations being within the walls of a large insurance company, is we had this thing called the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, which I had this vision of just these guys like, kind of opining and, we're going to cover this drug and this drug. And, the problem was that digital therapeutics did not, to use Eric Gastfriend's term, a square peg in a round hole. It didn't work. I mean, we were trying to use that Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee to approve these devices that didn't fall into that biologic category. And digital therapeutics take a different kind of lens. It takes a different skill set to really think about how digital therapeutics work. What's the science behind it? What are the algorithms? How do they work within EHRs? I mean, those are all things that a lot of folks that were in this Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, they had no background in vetting out digital solutions in any way, shape, or form. I don't necessarily blame the payer for that. I mean, again, we were in an unprecedented time. We were thrown into that. There was a flashpoint. However, we should have known better. So, and other payers as well. So, I mean, it's like, it wasn't as though they're brand new. I mean, these digital therapeutics existed before the pandemic. It's just like, it just pushed everything to a level where systems were not, it was no longer okay to kind of sit back and wait for, some kind of thing to happen.
Yeah. Great. All right. So as we're all looking towards the future now, pair is the past. It's great to think about what they've done right or wrong, but what's up next? And let's just go around as we did in the beginning. So Eric, G.
Sure. Well, and like I mentioned, I'm very excited about the Access to Prescription Digital Therapeutics Act. If we can get Medicare to create a new benefit category and cover it, I think that will have a cascading effect into commercial and Medicaid. And also, I want to point out, Pear made a lot of progress lobbying at the state level for state bills to cover digital therapeutics. And I think that's kind of like a missed opportunity. I haven't seen other digital therapeutics push as much at the state level. DynamiCare is trying to some extent, but each state controls their own Medicaid program, and there's opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it takes time to bring about change. Most major innovation categories that are analyzed, doesn't matter what part of our economy they're in, it takes about half the time to get to 1% penetration and about the other half the time to do the other 80 to 99% that eventually happens. And so whether it's the Human Genome Project or Amazon or whatever, leading to market dominance. And I think, after this, certain people will spend more time thinking about it and be more discreet in terms of how they think about them, how they categorize them, and how they value them, which I think gets at what, both Eric Gastfriend and Eric Bailey were talking about. And I think there will be products of various value types, and people will be more thoughtful about how to value them. And we will see non-FDA approved and FDA approved products ranging in price from $10 to $10,000 or more, I believe. But it'll happen in either a year or 3 years or 10 years, because that's the part you can't predict, which is why you can't waste too much money too quickly, because you don't control that timeline. Certain things are out of our control, even if you're doing something, really impactful. So I think we'll see all of those things make progress on all those fronts.
Yeah, I would agree with what Seth said earlier, that we're going to see a continued consolidation of these devices. And there are some fantastic devices out there that are doing some incredible things with respect to patient engagement and, helping providers work more effectively with their patients with respect to condition care management and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily translate to a particular digital startup really knowing how to have a scalable solution that goes over time and expands to the level that they need to survive. So there's going to have to be that sort of merger acquisition process that takes place. And with what Seth said earlier, there'll probably be a dozen or so, or maybe more, digital device companies that really continue to shape the industry in the future.
Well, thank you guys. I will just add on from my industry perspective. This was a rough year, but it was also a really great year. I think there's been a bit of a reckoning. We definitely hit that peak of inflated expectations earlier this year. But with that, I've seen incredible momentum. Right, the Access to Prescription Digital Therapeutic Act was just discussed in a bill hearing with Energy and Commerce. Right, there was Medicaid state coverage earlier this year. I see a new generation of companies coming to market, and they get to see some of the failures and some of the things that are working right. I have conversations with people that shouldn't know all about market access and coding, and they do, because of all the hard work that all of us have done. And so it really excites me to see that next generation and to see where this industry is heading. And I think everybody agrees on this call that this industry is heading to a positive place, but it's just going to take time. So thank you very much. This was a great panel. I think we could have gone on for another hour and a half to 2 hours, but unfortunately we have to call it here.